Hi everyone and welcome to this week's webinar. Today we've got Harry Lowton who's going to be presenting around Windows image referencing. So Harry is one of PowerOn's consultants and expertise within end user compute, so around EM&S, Windows 10, etc. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them or put them up into the chat group along the side. Harry will answer any questions you have at the end. But you are all on mute, so unfortunately we won't be able to say anything up to before then. We'll also be sharing the recording afterwards, which will be sent out to you on Monday. So if you have any questions or anything else, just give us a shout. So with that, I'll pass you over to Harry.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So, morning in my world, but afternoon for all of you, and thanks for joining me on a Friday. I'm sure you're waiting to join, and probably got other things to do, so we won't be spending too long. But yeah, we just want to go through, as Catherine said, benefits of using reference images. It says when deploying Windows 10, but it'll be stand true across the board of whatever operating system you're using, really. So for those of you who don't know me, so I'm Harry Lowton. As Catherine said, I work as a technical consultant here for PowerOn Platforms. I can see actually from the meeting I've met a few of you before, so that's awesome. Thanks for joining me again. And yeah, I specialize, as you said, on things like Configuration Manager, Microsoft Intune, Active Directory, and any other kind of supporting technology that helps our customers drive their kind of end-using compute strategy. If you want to keep up with some of the things that I write and the rest of the team write, you can go to poweronplatforms.com, and then our news and blogs will give you, what we find out there as kind of in the industry, more technical tips and some more higher level things, and you'll be able to find out what new webinars and so on are coming out. So the agenda today, I've kind of shortened it in this respect, but first of all, we're just going to get an introduction of Windows reference images, so make sure that we're all at a base level, talk about some terminologies and all that kind of stuff, make sure we know where we're going. That will kind of entwine with the lowdown on Windows reference images. Then I'm going to be talking about how do we actually get started then. So we'll talk about the theory to begin, and then we'll look at the more technical side, so the bit that we probably all can't wait to get to, so not the slideshow section, and we'll look at how do we start building that and what tools we're going to use to make this life easier as we go through our kind of reference image strategies. And at the end, I just want to share with you, show what some other people in the community has given back to us on scripts to help you with things like automation and really getting started in this journey if you haven't already started. So that's what we'll be spending our time on, and I think we have about an hour in, and we'll see whether we'll use all that time. So for me then, let's get started here. So first of all, what is even the drivers? So, I've put in, we're talking about the benefits. So what are the drivers why a company would even look at creating a reference image strategy and even one reference image in itself? So firstly, we like to start with things like security baselines. So I put actually on the blog post to this that we've all been in that scenario where we get a device and next thing we know, we've got 150 updates to do. And really from an end user, that's a bad experience. And from an IT person, we're killing all of our productivity in the sense of I can't get on and do my job till this machine in front of me has updated, and then I can configure it and deliver it out to the end user. So we're setting that security baseline. Once that machine is deployed, we know we're up to scratch with our patching, and we haven't got to start dealing with that afterwards, or even dealing with that on our deployment phase to add time. It also builds a fair amount of efficiency because we can start removing some things like network bandwidth, storage, and it's going to reduce some of our deployment time because even from that security baseline conversation there, we can see that if we're not taking an hour to start updating it as we deploy our Windows 10 or whatever it may be, we're reducing that time and gaining efficiency throughout it. And then having that reference image can gain flexibility. We can take that reference image, we can use maybe one reference image across different hardware platforms, and we can then use them for physical devices, virtual machines, we can convert them, and that really gives us the ability, once we've got a solid reference image strategy, we can use those files that we make throughout this in different scenarios across the business. So at a really high level, I didn't want to get too technical in this bit because some people will probably find what a WIM image is pretty boring, but The reality is what we're doing is we're taking that vanilla operating system image, so wherever you're downloading that from, MSDN, VLC, wherever it may be, we're taking that image, and from there we're just going to be piping in our own customizations, and at the end we'll end up with our own file with what meets our technical and business goals. And those files can come in a couple of different flavors. I mean, this is just talking about the Microsoft world in particular, so we can get that Wim file. And even if you looked at an ISO today and you went through it, you'd see you've got things like install.wim already. So we're making, in essence, our own install.wim, and that's what we'll use then to import into our management tools or whatever it may be, so that we can deploy that out in a fashion. And then we also have VHD here on the right, and that gives us even more flexibility. And we can use that, for example, in our Microsoft environments, for if we're using Hyper-V, Virtual Machine Manager, and we can start using that there. So we can create virtual templates as well as having our Wim files that we use for normal deployment. And it's worth noting that there's some cool PowerShell scripts out there, which if you just create everything as a Wim file with tools that we're going to be talking about, you can then convert them to VHD as well. And in fact, even in my environments, I do that. I create a load of Windows Server Wim files, and then I've just automated with PowerShell creating them into VHD so we can pipe them into templates in things like Virtual Machine Manager. So let's get ourselves straight on what some of the terminologies are when it comes to reference images. So if you've been in the game for a while and you've spent some time in it, these should be fairly familiar. And even if you go back to products, things like Semantic Ghost, will be how some of these were done. So starting off then, we've got thick images, and that thick image is really that monolithic image, and it's really throwing everything into the kitchen sink. And this was really where kind of Ghost sat. So we're going to throw in our operating system, all our applications, drivers, customizations, and everything. So that we have all of our apps in our environment and so on just piled into this one image, which obviously means there are a few cons to that, and one being it's going to be a fairly bloated image. Two, from a software point of view, if you throw all your applications into your image, well, if everyone in the environment truly was the same, then that may be productive, but the reality is, normally speaking, is not everybody needs every image, every application that you support. For example, a common one that I see while out consulting with our customers is somebody requests, oh, I need Visio, so you go install Visio, next person comes, oh, I need Visio as well, and in the end you just get bored of it, and you're like, oh, okay, fine, everyone needs Visio, and you throw it in the image, and then you deploy it. And the reality is one, not everybody needs Visio, correct me if I'm wrong, but generally speaking, your receptionists or even salespeople, whatever it may be, aren't sitting there creating beautiful Visio diagrams, so that would be a waste. And then from a licensing point of view, if you've just chucked every bit of software in there, you're going to find out if you get audited by Microsoft, you probably aren't going to be licensed to have Visio across the board. So the Fig has some challenges. There are some times if you make not a ridiculously thick image, but if you have most of your apps in there where it makes sense, and for example, like I've seen it in schools and things where they've got to quickly rip out the environment for a new class coming in or whatever it may be, and that there, thick images can be more useful. We then have thin, which in the deployment world became a little bit more elitist, and that's really just taking that operating system and then patching it to the level of our security baselines. And really nothing else goes in that. That's as vanilla as it can be to some degree. And then that hybrid side is taking the best of both worlds. So in the hybrid side, we'll be looking at how do we take the benefits of the thin image, which from the thin image side, that means that we're using just the operating system, and then above the operating system, we're then going to make sure that we're going to have a few key things. So we're going to put our software updates in there, and then we can use some core applications. And by core applications, I mean applications that have to be across the board. So if everybody needs these apps, then they can be worth putting in the Wim image. So for example, C++ runtimes, and then maybe Office, if it makes sense. If you're not always updating your Office, it could make sense to add Office here as well. So those are terminologies. So this just really covers that here. So what should be in your image when you're looking at your operating system. So Windows 10 in this conversation, your updates. So that's really made it easier in Windows 10. And in fact, as of October, any other platform really that you're going to be supporting, in the sense that we're that cumulative update model. So there won't be that many updates per se even to put on there, but it's worth putting it on before you start, because if you've been looking at Windows 10 and how the updates are, you find out that these cumulative updates every month are just getting a little bit bigger, and really it's something you have to look at in your environment, because if you're deploying a 1 gig file for just updates, it's how are you going to manage that going forward. And then we say core applications, so we're going to get in those C++ runtimes, and the reason why, and generally I get asked, why would I even bother putting in my C++ runtimes, and that's because we find that most applications, or a lot of applications that are developed for Windows, are going to be running on those runtimes. So it's worth getting them in. And I say you can put Office in, but just really don't go and put an application like Java or some Adobe products that are always going to need updating, because what you'll find is that will just add additional management to your reference image strategy and the life cycle of how quickly you can deploy these. So that being said, then what are some of the tools that we can use? Well, you can, if you really wanted to do this manually, you can grab a virtual machine and go in and configure it all how you like. You can pipe some DISM tools in, whatever it may be, and then sysprep it and create a WIM file out of it. But the reality is if you had a lot of operating systems that you're supporting, so like 10, 7, 8, Server 2012, that's going to become quite the tedious task. And really that's not going to help you make sure it's up to date, because by the time next month comes around, or if you did it every quarter, you're going to be pretty bored of doing this, and it's probably going to get left to the wayside. So in this conversation, we're not going to talk about the manual way of doing it in life. We're going to be going over to the automated side and talking about Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and Configuration Manager, which generally at this point I would normally get a question of, well, why would I use MDT? Why would I use Config Manager? And in fact, I could even integrate MDT into Configuration Manager. And that's a really good question. And quite often, that is a by organization, need and decision. But, we all have our personal preferences. And for me, MDT is where I prefer to have my reference image lab. And there are some good posts out there. If you look up deploymentresearch.com, Johan has written a pros and cons for both sides. And that will tell you, some of the benefits for MDT and some of them for Configuration Manager. But for me, here are some of the benefits for MDT. One, it's extremely lightweight. You need very little in the way of getting up with an MDT environment. It really just works on shares, so you can put it on desktops, Windows Server, and so on. And it doesn't take much to go. It's lightweight and it's easy to use. We also find out that it's really versatile. If I was to create an imaging configuration manager, for example, what we'll find out is that from there, I will end up with a config manager client in it and some key things that happen with Configuration Manager, and using that as building these WIM images. Rather than, if I take MDT, it's a really generalized approach. And I can create my reference images, and then I can put them into the management tools and so on of my choice. So, I can create my MDT WIM image, and then from there, I could put it into, I could go to Configuration Manager, Landesk, I could throw it into, Altiris. At the end here, we've got profile customization. So they both work, like if we were talking about Config Manager and MDT, they run in a different context. So MDT in itself runs as the admin profile, rather than Configuration Manager runs as local system. So inside the MDT way, we can actually put like suspends in and so on, and we can start modifying that default profile. With Configuration Manager, that is a lot more challenging and really isn't that as easy to do, or if possible to do. So MDT gives us, in my opinion, a lot more flexibility, and it's a lot easier for you to get up and going with, and also easier to delegate to other people in your organization. So you may not want the person you put to this to be in Config Manager, messing around with your Config Manager environment, building things in there, and you've got more scope for potential for them to deploy something wrong. And we've all seen the stories where somebody's deployed a Config Manager task sequence and it's wiped out their server estate. But you will find that will be a lot less inside the MDT side, as it's not the whole management suite, but it's really powerful in what it can do when we come to reference images and even deployment itself. So that's that side. So what do you need? Let's just get through this quickly so we can get into the demos. So what do you need? So we got MDT 2013 update 2. Really, if you're using Windows 10, that's where you want to find yourself. What can you install it on? So as you can see, Windows 7 all the way up to Windows 10. I managed to put a mistake on my slide there, but Windows Server 2012 and above, we just need the Windows Assessment and Deployment ADK, Windows PowerShell, and a .NET framework. So really light on that scenario, so you don't need much. You can even take your laptop, for example, and create your own reference image building workshop there. It just doesn't need much. And even, as consultants, that happens quite a lot. If we have a beastie machine, we can take that laptop with us and we can build reference images for our customers on the fly. So it's a really versatile product for me. And of course, one main benefit, it's completely free. So here's just the image creation flow then. Before I dive into the consoles and stuff, let's just have a look at some of the ways that you want to go through this. So in MDT, once you get it started and load up the console or the deployment workbench, the first thing that you're going to want to do is create a deployment share. And that deployment share is where we're going to store all of our applications, operating systems, and so on and so forth. And normally we have a specific share just for reference images. You're then going to add all your OSs, so all your operating systems, into MDT. From there, you can add all the applications that you're going to need, like those C++ runtimes. We can then build a task sequence. From there, we can configure what we call rules inside MDT, and really there, if anyone's used this before, things like custom settings INI and Bootstrap INI, we can start configuring them here. And then all we need to do is just capture the image. So we can either put a light touch ISO onto our virtual machines and then go capture that and then go have a coffee for an hour and we'll find out that we have a new WIM file. So it's a really simple flow, as we can see. I mean, I may have condensed it a little bit, but that's really the nuts and bolts of it. So before we jump into the demo, which is going to be the next stage of this, I just want to give one kind of golden rule. If there's anything that we take from, really today, I suppose, is that when you're building these reference images, in the past, potentially we would have maybe used an old desktop or whatever it may be, but really, the way to do it is to use virtual machines. You'll find you get a much cleaner image because we don't have to deal with anything like hardware drivers, and we don't want them getting into our reference image and then potentially causing conflict later down the line. But you also find it a much quicker and easier way of keeping your ongoing strategy going, because to build a virtual machine, you can do that in seconds with PowerShell, whatever tools you're using, and you can just make sure that you keep this consistent as you go through. So for me, if you're doing reference images, please make sure you're doing it on a virtual machine, and you'll find your life a lot easier as you go through. So that's great then. So let's go now, jump in then into my MDT server, and let's have a look at some of the components that put this all together. So I just get myself over to that server. Cool, so here we are. So here is already an MDT environment. So all I've done is just load it up. If you've not used this before, let me just make sure we're in the correct context here. So if you just go for the deployment workbench, that will get you to the same screen that I'm in. So all I've got in here, the server's really basic. I've just got ADK installed, MDT, and, well, this one technically has Hyper-V because it's a real host, but it's very simple for me to get started. And then from there, we have what we call deployment shares. So if you've not used this before and you're just starting, you're just going to have to come in, go new deployment share. It's going to be a path. So in my case, it's the local path C deployment share. And then you can set up the actual share name itself. So that will be where all your content will be stored. And then you can give it a descriptive name and so on. So generally speaking, if you're just using MDT, when we were talking about FIG, FIN, and hybrid images, because we're talking about that capture side, if we're using a FIN or a hybrid image, really the capturing section is just one part. We then need a specific tool to help us on deployment. So how do we then have that dynamic deployment approach of putting on the right applications and the right customizations? And that's where we would use things like Config Manager, but we could also use a production MDT share. So normally if we were just using MDT, we'd have a share for our reference image because they'd have their set of rules, and we'll talk about rules later. And then we'd have a production share which would have all your production task sequences and so on. And that would then have its own rules relevant to that share. So just worth knowing that a share has a specific set of rules, and we'll talk about rules later as we go through. So imagine you've created your share. That's obviously a great start. I've already got one here, so mine's just MDT factory reference image, and as you can see, that's located on my C drive. Unfortunately, due to space, I only have a C drive on this lab, but that is what it is. So we talked about all the things we need to get in here, applications, operating systems, and so on. And as we can see, really that's down the left-hand side, and it's very easy for us to get started. So if I go into applications, you'll note here that I've got some of the core applications that I'm going to need to make sure that I have a successful reference image. And one of the things you may know, which may seem a little bit OCD, is that I've got prefixes for all of these. So all of them have install and then what the name is. And this is just a recommendation to make sure that, when you're looking through the task sequences and so on, you can quickly visualize what this step is doing. So I can see, okay, this is going to be installing, Visual C++ runtimes and, or management frameworks. And what you need to do just to get going with this, just import your applications. So you can just go new application. And from here, you can choose whether it's a source file, on a network share. You can create what we call application bundles, which is just a grouping of applications. And if you've used any kind of application packaging software or config manager before, it's a very similar look and feel. So if we go to the properties of one of these applications, you've got the key info at the start here. In the details section then, so we'll just be setting out what are the quiet parameters for installing. So as we can see here, VC redist, and then I've got /q. So that's going to be a quiet install on that. And you'll see on other ones I've got /no restart and things like that. What you can do, and this is kind of personal preference as well, I suppose, is here you can say reboot the computer after installing this application. So if you know that it needs a reboot, so if Windows is going to throw a fit if you don't reboot it, you can either ask it to do it here, or later when we look at the task sequence, which is our logical steps of how this is going to deploy, you can go in and add a reboot step if you need to. So, we can see if I cancel out of here and I go to my .NET Framework 5, for example, and we go to details, we can see that I've got a quiet no restart. I'm not controlling it in the application, but then in the task sequence itself, I'm controlling that reboot on my own way. So I can see just from a logical point of view, and for other administrators, sometimes it's easier to see the steps in a task sequence than necessarily in the app. So that's the app side, very quick and easy to get in. All of it, as I say, is just shared, or just sat on share folders. So what I have in my environment, well, I have all my existing files. So these are all the source files that I got the information from. And then once you've done that, it gives you the option then to either move your source files into the deployment share, or you can copy them. And in this environment, I've just copied them. But if we go into our MDT factory, we'll just see that we then have all of our applications laid out nicely in here as well. So that's just where that's stored. Once you've got your applications in, and it is worth noting that MDT in itself is fully PowerShell aware. So you don't have to necessarily go through the boring task of importing all of these, and there are codes out there already, but you can just easily set up a text file or a CSV with the core information for each loopit and import it into MDT for you. So if you like PowerShell, that's really cool. And there are other bits that we'll see later where PowerShell comes in really helpful as well. Then you need to get your operating systems in. I've just split this down by folders for ease of view, but you can just go in and import. So as we see here for my Windows 10, I've got my 1607, I had 1511 one still in here. And that's a similar thing. We won't spend too much time in here, but import, you just got to choose a full source set. You can go find a WIN file and import that if you already have one, or get images from WDS in itself. I download all of mine from my MSDN or VLC, get the ISO, just attach it, and then just use that and copy my source files into my MDT directory. So same kind of idea, and that will get you going. So you want to get your apps in, you want to get your operating system in, and at this stage we're now ready kind of to move forward. We're not going to be using any out-of-box drivers, as we said. Really, as we're using virtual machines, we don't want any additional drivers coming into this. If you were using this for production deployment, of course you can start looking at drivers then, but for this we won't be. And now we have packages. Packages will just be that kind of art where you can actually do some things. So I'm showing here an example of where I'm actually using packages to pipe in some Windows Server 2012 hotfixes. You may not have to use these too often, but there are some use cases. For example, in the 1607 Windows 10, if you're using a earlier build, so I had just showed January, but if you're using an earlier build, there was a hotfix that you would sometimes have to add if you want to use WSUS and make sure that you can do updates in the capture image. You just have to pipe in one package first, and that would update that and make that work for you. And that's pretty well documented out on the internet as well. But that's what we can use packages for. There's a whole host of other things, but that's just an example for you. We'll come back to task sequences. We're not going to spend any time today on advanced configuration. That's a little bit more beyond where we want to be today, but you can do things like linking different deployment shares, looking at using a SQL database, and so on. And then monitoring, which I recommend setting up, but monitoring in itself will be the ability to go and view what's happening with one of your task sequences. So that's really simple, and we'll look at that and how that's set up. But for now, let's go have a look at our task sequences and kind of create that look and feel. I'm just going to delete this one for now. So let me just delete. The one thing that I just wanted to show you, so I just deleted that task sequence, but something to show from that is every time you do something in MDT, when you get to the end, you'll always see a view script, so you can see that I'm doing remove item, path, and what I'm removing. So that will come in really helpful if you're building automation around this or looking at it. Anytime you do an action, you can see that you're getting the script and the PowerShell information to do that. So let's create ourselves a new task sequence. How do we go about that? Well, first of all, we've got to give it an ID. So I could do 1607 and ref example. I probably shouldn't be typing in a demo, but let's just do it. So we can create our task sequence name, nice and simple. From there, you just need to select a template. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through what all of these are, but you can see you've got server ones, VHD information in here, and so on. I'm just going to use my standard client task sequence, as that will fit the bill for what I'm trying to achieve. Choose the operating system, so as Windows 10 is the latest, let's use that. So I'm just going to choose my Windows 10 January 27 edition. You can now choose what product key. Generally speaking, I'm going to activate my image and activate my operating system at the deployment phase, so I'm not going to specify any kind of product key here and move on. You can choose any of the operating systems information that comes in, so I could do power on, and then you could choose an Internet Explorer homepage if you need. All these settings, of course, can be changed later, and this is really just saving you having to go into that unattended XML and change it all yourself. It's going to do that for you. And then when that image is created, if you were to ever load it up and start trying to do something with it, do you want a local administrator password that you choose, or do you want to specify a password at another time? And as I was talking earlier, there's this custom settings INI, and that can do some really powerful things. And for me, I'm actually setting that password inside my custom settings INI, so I don't need to put an admin password here, and we'll go back and talk about that later. So let's just create that. As we can see again, you can view that script, so if you need the PowerShell, you can get that out and start utilizing it yourself. Let's go for finish there. So we've got our task sequence. If we go to properties, there we are. We can see just some generalized information. We won't spend much time on that. From the OS info, it already found out what operating system I'm in. And the cool thing about MDT is it really tries to interact in your environment. So it knows that potentially you might want to use unattended XML. You can click that, it will load it up for you, and you can start in the image manager configuring that to your needs. The reality is, though, when we're creating reference images, you don't really find yourself often going into that unattended XML. And I wouldn't recommend it too much, but there is one setting, and you can see that I've sent some reference links at the end of this presentation, but you'll be able to see that there is one for protecting your computer, and what that does is just means that when you go and deploy it and the machine is in its operating system, instead of it going and just doing its updates when it feels like, oh, this is a good time for me to do Windows updates, instead of it doing that, it will just wait till when you start calling the Windows update mechanism to run. So I recommend looking at that, and I say we'll send you links to resources, so you haven't got to memorize that. So now we're back. This is our task sequence. If you've never seen a task sequence before from MDT or Config Manager, all it is just logical steps of flow. So it starts with step 1, and then it goes down the board. And under these groups, we just have different sections. And we can set conditions. So for example, state capture, we're not going to do that here because we're going to have a condition on that, and it's not going to run that. So it's just in there, but it's not going to necessarily do anything. From initialization then all the way to state restore, it's really the bits that we're not worrying about. This is the bits MDT is going to do for us, and it's going to get that operating system installed. So as you can see, it's got the install operating system and the one that we chose. But what we're interested in is, right, you've installed the operating system, that's great, but now we want to be at the stage where we're inside Windows and we can start configuring this reference image to our needs. So that's after the state restore. We can see a couple of key sections, like pre-application installation and post-application installation. So there may be a few things that you want to do before pre-application installation and then after as well. But let's start with how do we add some things in. So we talked about applications first, so let's talk about that here as well. So we've already got a pre-baked step in here for install applications. And out the box, all that's saying for us is we want to install multiple applications. And we have this notion inside MDT of using what we call mandatory applications. So I've specified, and believe it or not, in the custom settings INI, which we'll come to, some mandatory applications. If I've done that, then it's going to install them at this stage. If I haven't gone that route and I actually want to see everything in the task sequence, and people, as I say, have different schools of thought on this. Some people like to put it in the custom settings INI just to make it easy and know that everyone's going to get it. And some people like to visually see, if they load up a task sequence, I want to see every single step that's happening. So I could go install a single application, I can browse, and then we can say, we're going to need to install our Visual C++ runtimes, okay. And then you're going to have that there. And the next good rule of thumb is to take whatever the name is, that's why we've got the install dash, and you can put that then in the name. So now, if any other administrator comes in, they'll be able to easily look down that and go, okay, great, I'm installing Microsoft Visual C++ 2005. And then if you need another application, it's as simple as coming up here to the top left, going add, general, and then we can just come in and install an application. And it would be a similar flow. So I could go install, browse, and then we could choose maybe 2008 as well. So that's just an example of how that can work. So we can do it either from mandatory, as I discussed, and we will see later in this demonstration, or you can come and put in those logical flows. So that's how you get your apps in. Nice and simple. So what are a few other things that we want to do here? Well, we've got these Windows update steps. And if you just don't do anything else on these, they're going to end up going to Microsoft. But first of all, we need to enable them. So if I go to options here, and this is where you can set some more stuff. So here you can actually add conditions. So if you've got any WMI queries, so later in your production, if you were doing it, maybe it would be like, if this machine equals this model, then I'm going to want you to put these drivers on, for example. But we're going to enable the step again, and as you can see, it's now come to life. And then we'll also do that for the post on it as well, so I can make that come to life as well. In my environment then, so instead of making this go to Microsoft, I've got a WSUS server, and this is another benefit of MDT. WSUS is much more reliable and easier to use than creating a reference image necessarily in Config Manager and using software updates that way. But I like to make sure this is enabled, and then I have a WSUS server which has got all the right products, classifications, and so on. And I can actually configure where that location is inside the custom settings INI as well, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So at this stage, we're booting into Windows, we're getting all our software updates in, we're getting our applications in. But when it comes to Windows 10 and other operating systems, there's probably a few other things that I do want to do. So I can come over into Add, and then if we come down to Roles, there's a load of other options all the way down here, but if we come to Roles, we can see that we've got install and uninstall roles and features. We're not going to use the uninstall, but if I go to install roles and features, we can then come back to the properties, and we can see that there's some things that we're going to want on our devices. So pretty much all of your environments are going to need .NET Framework 3.5. That also includes 0.2 and 0.3 as well. So you might want to do that. But there's also a whole host of other things you might want to do. So maybe you want to add in Hyper-V. If you're using and you want to start using, in fact, there was another webinar all about Windows 10 and talking about some of the new security features. But if you want to start using some of those new security features like Credential Guard, you're going to need things like the Hyper-V hypervisor in there and the service to be running. So you could go in and perceivably add Hyper-V here as well, and a load of other tools if people need. And if you're using like Windows 7, for example, you can add ones that are useful as well. So just note that you can install roles and features. The one caveat is make sure that you've got the right operating system selected, because if you change that, as you'll see, so if I do Windows Server, I could now start installing certificate services, ADFS, and things like that. Well, they're clearly not going to install well on Windows 10, so just make sure you choose Windows 10. But it does show you the flexibility of this tool. You could, if you want to create a reference image of how a domain controller should be stood up, you could go and do that perceivably this way. And in fact, you'll see out there, there are quite a few what they call hydration kits, which set up a whole proof of concept for you, which install domain controllers and DCs and everything else, and gets all your Active Directory environment up by just using tools like MDT. So this is a very powerful tool in that respect. So that's great. So we've got our roles in, we're doing our Windows updates, we're installing our applications, and then we're making sure after we've got our apps installed, so if I had Office here, for example, I may want to make sure that's up to date. It's then going to go and do my Windows updates. And really, from a very basic task sequence, you can get away with just that. The whole point of creating these reference images is to make it simple and repeatable. You don't want to have to have loads of crazy steps and more scope for it to go wrong, and realistically you're not going to need that much there, because as we said, if we're going for that kind of hybrid approach, just getting those updates in and applications is really all we want to get to. And I've got a few examples of production ones that I use here, and they look pretty much identical. I'm installing my .NET frameworks, we've got all my applications as mandatory. I have a few cleanup steps as well, and you can find some of these scripts that I'm using there in the community, and I've got links to that later, and all that does is just resets my WSUS and cleans out a bit of the information to make sure that I'm not bloating the image any more than I need to. So at this stage we would be pretty confident that we have a task sequence which is going to fit the bill for that kind of hybrid / thin image kind of approach. So what's left to look at? Well, if we come back to our deployment share and go to properties, from the first screen, this is going to be general information. So, what's my UNC path? So, PON MDT01 MDT factory. What platforms are we supporting? Generally, you're not going to make any changes here and just leave that as it is. If we go from one way to the other, so from monitoring here, if I enable this, that will then set up the monitoring service for me, and we'll see that inside services. If you went to services MSC, you'd actually be able to see that there as well. And then it adds something to the rules, which we'll talk about. We then have Windows PE, and again, you don't really have to change anything here. You don't have to change the scratch size, or if you don't want to change the background images, you don't have to do any of that. But this is just the information that we'll use later on when we do what we call an update our deployment share. It goes out and creates these things for us. So it will go and create that light touch ISO and a PE image and so on and so forth. You really don't need to these days configure this too much. You don't need to add features. We definitely in our reference images don't need to add drivers, because as we said, we're doing it on virtual machines and we don't want drivers there. And then we've got the rules section. So this is, as we were talking about, so this is our custom settings INI, and I will come back to the screen in a second, but just because I have a password. We're going to come into, first of all, this edit bootstrap INI. So if you just bear with me for 2 seconds. Okay, let me just bring that back into our environment. So we have our bootstrap INI. When a machine first boots, if we've got, like, for example, that light touch ISO on the device, when it first boots up, it's going to go through this bootstrap INI process. And you need to make sure that you've configured this. So first of all, you can see under default here, we've got this deploy route. So this is my MDT share. So we need to make sure that the device is aware of what that UNC path is. We've got that skip BDD welcome yes. For all intents and purposes, BDD was an old name for MDT. So this just skips the first kind of initial wizard, which is kind of that always kind of help information to start with, like, oh, what do you want to do? Install a task sequence and so on and so forth. So we don't want to see that, to be honest. We know what we're doing when we get in there, so we just close that out. And then I just have my ID for that device to be able to come back and interact with my MDT shares. So it doesn't have to be a domain admin, and if you're using domain admins and so on, you're doing this wrong. All it needs is access to read the MDT share, and then have write access, for example, to wherever you're putting the end captures. And if you're doing logging, then you just have to have access to that. But it doesn't have to even be a domain account. As you can see here, I'm actually using user ID MDT user, and on the user domain is PON MDT01, and that's actually the device we're using right now. So this is a local account. It's not an admin or anything. It's just got the right ACLs and share permissions for the folders that we need. So just make sure that you're not using admin there, and you'll be all good to go. And now we have what potentially looks overwhelming, but I've just got a fair amount of stuff in here, but actually it's all just settings. So this is what we now call our custom settings INI. So what am I saying here? I'll just key out some of the key sections in here. So these rules are all heavily documented, as you would imagine, on Microsoft, and I'll show some community scripts in a bit, which even has some of these already pre-baked in for you. So this event service, PON MDT01, that's for my monitoring. That's to make my monitoring work. You can see that we're doing OS install Y, so yes, we want to install operating systems. Admin password, so when we said earlier that I don't want to specify a password, I can specify it in here. We have a few other things like time zones, what work group am I going to join. We can see WSUS server, so what WSUS server am I connecting to? So I'm connecting to actually a different MDT environment for my WSUS. We can see information about logging, where I can automate my backup share, so it's going to go to MDT factory and then the folder captures. So that would end up, if I was back in here, MDT and then captures. So this is where my reference images would end up. So if I just close out of here, and then we can see if, as we go down, we've got our network information and so on and so forth. But these ones here are useful as well. So we've got skips. And I think with a skip in it is meaning basically we want to skip a certain section and a certain questioning inside our environment. So, we don't want to see information about what applications, or I don't want to select locales, because the reality is I know what location is, and I can form that myself. I want to skip roles and features and so on. So that's what they're there for. And that's it. This is really well documented online, and you can screenshot if you want, and I'll show you guys where to get this from. Anyway, and at the bottom here then, we just have what I was talking about from an application point of view. So I have mandatory application 001 and then a string GUID. And this means then if I have that step which goes install this as mandatory, that will go and do that for me. So that will make sure that it will install that wherever comes in this device. And you can go get those GUIDs really easily. So you just mandatory app, 00 and a number, and then equals and squiggly brackets, or in PowerShell world, script block, and then that number. So where do you actually get them from? So if you're in applications and you just scroll across, you'll find out that you have the unique GUIDs here on the far right. So if you wanted to do it this way and didn't want to add it into the task sequence, you just take this unique GUID and then you say it's a mandatory app, and it will install that way. So that's cool. So we've got our custom settings set up, we've got all of our task sequences ready to roll, and our applications in there. So the next step in your environment would be to come in and update this deployment share. If you make any changes to boot settings INI, for example, you want to make sure you've updated it, as some of this information will be piped in to this information. And once it's done that, it will then go and create all your boot files and everything that you need. So if I go back to my file explorer, which is on my other screen, so if I just drag that back in. So if you go back into your local disk, if I'm in my deployment shares, MDT factory, and then we come down here into boot, you'll see that I've got my light touch x86. So if we add this to a device and boot off of it, it will then add and boot into effectively our MDT environment. So we can actually show that if I bring up my virtual machines here. So if I load one up, let me just, my screen res is a little off because I lowered it so we could all see it. But if I just go back to the start here, okay, that's what you get for leaving that on overnight. So what I was going to show there, let's just restart that and get it to boot up again. So inside this virtual machine, while that's booting up, all I've done is attached, so that will be booting off on my screen. If we just go to settings, okay. So all I've done here in the settings side is just added the DVD for that light touch PE x86, and because I've done that, that's now just booting automatically into our Microsoft deployment toolkit. And as I haven't got any other rules on to set this, when it comes through, it's then going to ask us what task sequence do I want to run. So one of these options, do I want to add any applications? So first of all, it's just going to go through that bootstrap ini and gather all the information it needs. And we'll just give that a second here so I can show us that before I go talk about some other cool things that we can do with MDT. So hopefully that will load. Okay. That's why I pre-baked it last night, but it seems like it timed out throughout our time looking at that. But we can jump back into that in a moment when it wakes up. Let me just jump out of my virtual machine for now. So what that would do is it would ask us for a task sequence, go through, ask me where I want to capture the image to, and it will go from there. But before we, and I realise that I'm probably running out of time throughout this anyway, so I just wanted to go through a few community tools. So first things first, if you haven't got anything in your MDT environment, if you haven't even started today, then Nicolas, your Microsoft MVP, has written this really cool tool called MDT Factory. And what this does for you is you need to go get all your source files, so your MDT and what applications you're going to import. So you can see from some of the slide there what applications, operating system, you can set up WSUS. But it just gives you that GUI to be able to go, right, I need this MDT, XE, I need all these apps and all these OSs. And what it will do is it will go then install it all for you, create that deployment share, and then using PowerShell, it will import those apps, operating systems, and create those base task sequences. So everything that we've just shown you how to do manually, this will automate you getting started. So I've got the link on the screen there as well. So if you haven't started MDT, the goal of this and why he made this was to really make it easy for you to start from scratch. So you don't have to do everything yourself. This can do the automation for you. So that's a cool tool. Recommend looking at that. And then we have from Michael Nystrom from deploymentbunny.com, which is a pretty awesome URL, has created another kind of reference image factory. So this is slightly different. So rather than this doing all that initial setup and automation, this is how we look at our continuous automation. So, I can, there's let's say the URL there, but if I jump back into our lab, okay, so before we do that, let's just quickly explain this then. So this has finally done what we wanted. So I can now choose, because I haven't skipped this section, I could choose what task sequence I want. So, we can come down, we can see that we've created that Windows 10 1607 reference image. I could use that, go to next. In my environment, I haven't skipped much beyond that. So all it's going to choose for me then is where do I want to capture my image. And this is pretty interesting, this screen. If you leave this on from your custom settings INI, when you're first building these task sequences, what you'll find is you may not want to capture your image straight away, because if for some reason anything breaks throughout it, if you add another half an hour at the end of this process waiting for it to capture an image back to a share, that's quite a lot of time you've wasted. So you may want to just go with do not capture this image, run the task sequence out. When you're happy that it all works great and it's doing everything you want, you can then capture your image. And if you haven't, you saw I had it specified earlier. If you haven't got it specified, it will just link you to this and you can just choose where you want to locate it. So that's really, as simple as it is. Then from all I'd have to do then is just click next, and that's just going to kick off and start my reference image. And at the end, if we had, 15 minutes to wait and watch that, we'd end up with a new WIM image in that capture folder. So that's that side. But before we finish, I also wanted to show you this this reference image factory that Michael has created. So it's all ran on PowerShell. It's really simple to get started with, and this is what the end goal of this is really to mean that every month or quarter, if we need a new set of reference images, once we've created all our task sequences, we can run this code. It will go create our virtual machines in Hyper-V for us. It will then add that ISO to the VM, and then it will boot it up. Once it's booted it up, it will then install or run the task sequence, capture it back, and then remove those virtual machines, do that cleanup phase. So it's a really cool tool for looking at the ongoing management of your images. So how do you set it up? Well, it's super easy. I have under my setups file, I have this is his download. You can get it from GitHub. So image factory, and then you've just got to come in and actually choose what some of the XML settings are here. So how many VMs should run at a time. So depending on how beastie your node is, what's your deployment share location, reference tasks, and then you go down here like what logical switches do you want to add to, and so on. So yeah, only like 8 or 10 questions. Once you've filled that in, you can actually, as we were talking about, custom settings and so on. Really cool thing is even added you custom settings, so you can go look at these and see what he's got in for you, which would be fairly similar to what I've got in mine. I've just added a few more. And then you've also got a bootstrap in it. So these will get you started with those custom settings as well. So once you've done that, then all there is you've got to just run the image factory build. Now, I'm not going to run the whole script because I just wanted to show you it to a certain step. So if I just close that out, so I'm just going to run it to a certain step. And what it's going to do in the background then is it's going to go look at what task sequences I have, and then it's going to go into my Hyper-V environment, and we'll see it sooner or later start creating virtual machines in here. So there we go. We've got Windows 10 Enterprise 1607 just turned on. It didn't turn on, but it just got created, 1511, and so on. So those machines will build, and where they're building from is in this folder here, so Windows 10. So we've got an exact copy, effectively, inside my Hyper-V. So we've now created those images. Some of the cool things now is that it's automatically, if I just go settings, I realize I'm running out of time, but if I go to settings, you can see here that it's already added in, for example, that light touch ISO as well. A couple of cool things that it does do for you is how this actually works then, is it modifies your custom settings INI, or it hasn't finished doing that, or hasn't updated for me. So let's just cancel that out a second. Properties, go to rules. Let's scroll down. There we go. So now we see we've got a lot more settings at the bottom here, but what it's done for us is for every one of those BIOSes, or the actual MAC address, it's gone and then said the OSD computer name, this will be what the computer's called, this is a task sequence ID it will run, and now it's skipping a few formal things. So it's now not going to ask us about the task sequence, not going to ask us about apps, it's going to do that capture, and it's going to automate that for us. So if I was to run a machine now, so if we opened up 1607, for example, and powered that on, so the script, of course, would power all this on for you. I just stopped it at that stage so we could talk about it. But this will now power it on. It'll go straight into Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. I won't have to ask any questions, or I won't ask any questions of me. It will just go and automate that. And then at the end of this, you can now leave your environment for the next hour or so. And when you come back, you'll have a WIM image in your capture file. All that, the actual custom settings INI will be cleaned up, and your virtual machines will be removed so that when you run this again, you're not rebuilding on top of that. So if we just gave this like 2 more seconds, as I say, what we'll find is once it's found all the boot settings and what it's running, is it would just kick straight off into that. So rather than last time when we got to this stage, we saw that I chose that task sequence, what we'll see in hopefully pretty short amount of time is that we'll just jump in. So I'm just going to, while we're waiting for that, I'll just minimize that out. Okay, actually it's just about to start. So there we go. So we can see there that straight away, without asking me any questions, it's already going through and running that task sequence. And if I waited for an hour now, we'll come back and we'll have an image ready to go. So really recommend checking out those two tools. They should make your life a lot easier when you're getting started in the MDT world. So just to give you a few more resources then. So a couple of additional resources. First link here is just the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit documentation. Recommend checking it out. Some really good guides on there. And actually, for Microsoft, these documents have screenshots and everything, and they're well documented. So recommend hitting up that link. And then just another good resource to go look at from Johan and Amy here from Deployment Research. Just go have a look at their website. They've got some really good guides on setting up task sequences and just some general tips of your deployment and how, what they find out when they're out consulting and speaking with customers on that kind of image management and deployment as a whole. And really, that is all the slides I have. So I have 4 minutes to the end. And now it's, time for questions. Thank you all for listening. So Catherine, I don't know if people get unmuted here. So Harry, do we have to update to a newer MDT with release of each updated version of Windows 10? Not specifically, no, at the moment. The MDT that we're using has been out for a fair while. You will find, though, as time goes on, that there will be updates to it, and it might make sense. But normally speaking, from a recommendation, it's the later ADKs will help you out. Normally, you can, if you're talking about what version to go for, if you go for the latest 2013, it will give you the ability to do things like Windows 10, but then you can go down versions rather than if you're using like a 2012 still, it's not going to have that support per se for Windows 10. So I would recommend going to the latest right now if you're doing Windows 10, as it fixes a few bugs that we saw in earlier versions. Any more questions? Catherine, do we unmute people and let them talk, or is it just typing?
We can do if you want to.
I don't mind either way.
I think Ben's sending a message. It depends. Some people don't always have phone capability. That was all.
Yeah, no worries. I did see some comments on the email which had a few questions on BIOS to UEFI and things like that. We won't be covering it in this, but there are some great blog posts out there, especially if you're using Dell. So actually, if you go back to that Nicolaj, and if you look at Mike Terrell, he'll help you on looking at moving from BIOS to UEFI. And even if you look at 1E as a whole, they have some tools out there to help you as well. And also, if you're using Config Manager, if you move to 1610, there's some new options in there and some variables like TS UEFI drive and so on. Are you planning doing a webinar on how we can use this in Config Manager? That's a great idea, Ben, and yeah, I'm sure we will do a webinar on the next stages of this. And we actually have, at Power On, we have some training as well. So we have a whole training course that you can look at, which will give you, it's about 7 hours of content going from all these topics, and OSD is in there as well. So if you're interested, feel free to look at that. Cool. Any more? All right, we just got one more coming in here. Is web going to be merged with WSUS? I've not seen that that's going to be the case yet. They're kind of used for different reasons. So I would say no to that, to be honest. Not for the foreseeable future. I have no more information. So. Cool. Well, if there's no more, feel free to. Oh, we have one more. Feel free to reach out, of course. You can always hit us up with questions. If you've got any questions afterwards, please email us in with them, because I can then do a blog post with a Q&A afterwards, and you can go read them from there. So that's awesome. So if there's no more, I suppose I can let you get back to your Friday.